So we talked about the knocking on doors. We're trying to encourage and evangelize. And remember, we have the whole thing that we set up was there are different kind of calls. There are those that are simply friendly calls that we make to people. There are calls that we want to are church-centered. That is, we're inviting them to services. We are interested in spiritual things. And there are the calls that we make, which we're actually studying with someone and trying to make them come to a decision and make them, not make them, but trying to lead them so that they might make a decision to follow Christ and be baptized into Christ. And then those are the calls. Then finally the decision calls. That's the last one, the decision calls. So those are the different kinds of calls. With that in mind, so we're looking at, we went through the first four already. There's a one-time Christian. That is one who is baptized and is no longer faithful. The liquor problem, that is, we can call it also the drug problem today. There are a lot of families that have a lot of issues with alcohol, drugs, and so that's a little different thing that you might run into, and that's what we've talked about there. The religiously divided home, that of course is a major problem, and then different religious backgrounds. People have those. We've looked at that also. But now let's look at number 5. I think that's where we are, starting at number 5, domestic problems. And so in this one, I'm thinking specifically of sometimes you're visiting with someone. You don't have to knock on the door and come into the house, but they might come to you. You might be visiting with them at the coffee shop or at the deli or something, and they are sharing with you that the problems that they have in the family. So what are some things we need to keep in mind as we're trying to influence them for Christ about such an interview? Number 1, confidentiality. Confidentiality. There are several people in this community with whom you visited, with whom I visited, and they're going to say, you know, here's the kind of problems me and the husband are having. Me and the wife are having. Well, that's going to be first and foremost on the mind. It reminds me, just as an illustration, when I was in juvenile detention, I thought, teaching the class, I taught school in juvenile detention, I thought, okay, I'm supposed to be teaching this material, and they might have a testing day, and then the probation officer would come in and give them their papers, and here's their court papers, and here's what they're going to go face with at court, and I think, we are being silly to think that they're going to be actually focused upon schoolwork when they might be going before a judge and going to jail. They're not going to be focused upon the test. And I was just always kind of frustrated with the system that would want me to, okay, you need to put those court papers away and get back on your test and bubble this in and bubble that in. And they've got more pressing issues than to know whether they've passed a math test. And that's the reality. And so exactly here, sometimes you're visiting with people and you come across, well, here's what's happening. We have this huge issue in the family. Well, that's going to be first in their mind before really, okay, what do I need to do to obey the gospel? They're going to be really focused upon that. So what do we do? Number 1 is confidentiality, right? Be a good listener. That's the thing. Just be a good listener. That's right. Be a friend. Be a good listener. There's always, of course, you want to leave the room, the door open for another time that you can visit with them. But you need, of course, at this point, I think you've said it all, really. Just be a good listener and assist them in whatever you can. Sometimes they might need to be deferred to a professional for help. A lot of times I've had people come to the office, not lately or anything, but I've had people come and I think, this is a major issue, and I don't think I'm equipped really to handle it. I can tell what the Bible says. I can tell what the Bible says about a husband and wife, but some of the issues that they bring up, I think, wow, I don't know. And I will say, well, you know what, there's a counselor, and here's a counselor, and I want to find a Christian counselor for them, not just a secular counselor, a Christian counselor, and then defer them. And so sometimes I have to do that. And that's my tack on that. So anything that you have to add on that, you might mention. So there are going to be domestic problems, and you'll run into them when you're discussing the Bible with people. So now, You know what? One thing you could say also, and I might mention this, put it in my notes. I said, you might try to direct a conversation to the effect that we need to get our life right with God. And when you get your life right with God, and your partner's life is right with God, then things work out a lot more smoothly than if you're not. If you're both outside of Christ, and I do try to push in that direction a little bit. I don't want to be abrasive and say, well, I don't want to hear about that, but I'm here to talk about being baptized into Christ. I don't do it that way, but I do want to talk about centering their life on Christ and point out that this is a good time they might be open to that kind of conversation. So that's something to think about also. Any other comments? Right, or even if they're Christians. Even if they're Christians that are unfaithful, we're going back up to the number one, the one-time Christian, and they're talking about these problems, I would do the same thing. I'll try to take the conversation in that direction, that there is a Christ-centered life here and a Christ-centered life here, both of them, then the problems are going to be much easier to work through. Wouldn't you agree? And I would think that that would be a way to go. You don't have to get down to the specifics, but you can talk about that. Let's talk, I want to look at number 6 for a moment, the indifferent. And this is from Hebrews chapter 12. So I want you to look at Hebrews 12. I think the verses are 13 and following. Hebrews 12 is verses 13. I think maybe it's verse 14 and following. All right, so here's how Paul, whom I believe is the writer of Hebrews, talks about it. Verse 14 begins the paragraph. All right, everybody with me? Follow after peace with all men, and the sanctification without which no man shall see the Lord. That is, you being sanctified, set apart yourself. You follow after peace with people, you're sanctified also. Looking carefully, lest there be any man that falls short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby the many be defiled. All right, there's a congregational setting. Root of bitterness, we need to stamp out the roots of bitterness. People sometimes become bitter, and that root kind of spreads. You can see that in congregations. Yes, sir. That's true. Yeah, so we need to be careful of that. All right, so verse 16. Now here's the real key passage in this one in my mind. Lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one mess of meat sold his own birthright. I want you to look at that word profane. Profane is the word common. We use it to refer to profane language, profanity, foul language. But the word profane in this context refers to worldly minded or indifferent, does not care about spiritual things. And that's how he goes on to define Esau in the next very line. Esau, who for one mess of meat, that is for a bowl of soup, sold his own birthright. He had a birthright which had spiritual blessings attached to it, but he cared not for spiritual blessings. He cared instead for simply the food. Now, what does that say? That's profanity. That is the real concept of profane. It means, the word profane means common. Profane people are those who are interested in playing ball, playing games, food, and those things such as that, instead of putting spiritual things at the top of the list. That's the word profane. And he was exactly that way. He cared not for the spiritual blessings of his family, but instead cared more for his bowl of pottage. And that's what it's about. He cared more just for the food that he has right now. That's a lot of people are that way. And that is profane. We care more about what's cutting the grass in my lawn right now than I do weeding the garden of my soul. I care more about I care more about my garden right here in the house, around the house, and making sure it looks good, more than taking the weeds out of my life. And that's where they are. They care more about the dust on the furniture than the dust on the soul. They're more interested in simply Worldly things. Worldly, sometimes we think about it as sinful activity, but profane does not necessarily include that. It means simply you count not spiritual things a high enough priority. You count worldly things as more. There's nothing wrong with cutting the grass, nothing wrong with dusting the furniture, nothing wrong with those things and beautifying things and being interested in food. We have to be all those things, but when you put those things as a higher priority than you do spiritual matters, that's the problem. So what do we do with it, the indifferent here? In my mind, I think this is the most difficult. I started off by saying number one is probably the most difficult, but really, I think now that we're on the indifferent, I think this is the most difficult person to reach. Don't you think? Indifferent. You can't create interest by simply speaking with them sometimes, and that's very, very challenging. Yes, sir. Well, they may be. They may don't want you to tell them what to do. The whole point, though, is more interested in physical things and profane things, worldly things, not wrong things, but worldly things, more interested in that. It's not wrong to play ball. But there are a lot of people right now who are much more interested in the ball score than they are in worshiping God. Yes, sir. That's right. That's right. That's right. There's not anything going on. It's the fact that they're more interested in turning on the television and living their life and not being interested in spiritual things. That was Esau. That's what he was. Okay. The religious versus the non-religious, she points out, right? And it's kind of funny. She mentioned Isaac and Jacob and Esau. And then we have that contrast. Isaac versus Ishmael, Jacob versus Esau. That's not to say that Jacob was flawless, but he was more interested in the spiritual things, as was also Isaac, his father. But Ishmael was not, neither was Esau, not interested in spiritual things at all. And that's the indifferent in society. I don't care. And we see that a lot in the church, too, because most of the communities are filled with this kind of people. Exactly so. Any comments, any thoughts? Yes, ma'am. Maybe so. We can call it that. Someone has a foot in the world, a foot in the church, and they just are right in the fence. They're not really dedicated one way or the other. Well, yeah, but it is the case that so many churches are quiet and silent on the issue of people living together, and that's wrong. And we need to speak out about the wrongness of that in fornication. That's right. Well, I wouldn't say you don't associate. I wouldn't say that on even if withdrawing fellowship with a person. So if you withdraw fellowship, okay, let's back up. If the church withdraws fellowship from an individual, Paul says, with such a one know not to eat, 1 Corinthians 5. However, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, he says, don't count them as an enemy, but admonish them as brethren. I would never say don't associate, because that gets the idea that, okay, you can't come in the door here and worship with that. I would never say you need to get out. Individually either. I wouldn't say don't associate. I wouldn't say don't associate, but I would say that we need to encourage that person to make their life right and make that a predominant thought about it, but not to go along simply as if nothing has ever happened. What's meant by the scripture, admonish them as a brother, if we're not associating with them? Yeah. Well, I'm not saying that's wrong, but that also applies to a passage, in a passage that a person has been withdrawn from. And that's, he says, with that person, when the church makes a decision, withdraws from a person, and we don't see many people churches doing that today, but that's when a church withdraws from an individual, he says, with such a one know not to eat. I hesitate to apply that across the board to any person that we think is in sin in a community of Christians. I personally a little bit hesitant to apply it that way. But at the same time, I say 2 Thessalonians 3, admonish them as Christians. I don't know exactly how, but that's what 1 Corinthians 5 is about. People who have been withdrawn from, with such a one not to eat. And there are other people I know that feel that way, and I say, well, sometimes it has to be a decision by the church before we do that. But say again. Yeah. Yeah, now I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not saying you're wrong on that, Lisa. I don't know. I'm not sure about that. Yeah. Yeah, and I think Lisa's talking about someone in the church. And what do you do if they're in the church and they're living, for example, living with someone and they're not living right? Well, I don't say, okay, let's just, right now, let's slam the door on that and say, well, that's true too. That's correct. And that's what 2 Thessalonians 3 is about. Admonish, encourage those people. So that's why I say, all right, someone comes in here and worships with us. I know that there are a couple of homosexuals come in here. I'm not going to say, get out of here. I'm not going to do that. I think that would be wrong. At the same time, that does not mean that we extend them the right hand of fellowship and say everything's going to be fine and we accept you as is. But Jan's had her hand up there. Yeah, how would Jesus handle it? Well, sometimes it's pretty difficult, and all we know is to go about what Jesus said on the subject. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's true, and I don't want to be unwelcoming in a congregation. No matter who comes here, I don't want to be unwelcoming to people. Yeah, that's my bottom line on that one. But some of those issues, and I'm going to say as with Lisa's example, though some of those issues are challenging how to deal with them, and I do get frustrated with church leaderships who refuse to take a stand on such issues. What can we do about it? Well, they don't admonish them, they don't go to them, they don't say you need to stop this, you need to quit it, or anything like that, and that's pretty sad. Yes, ma'am. Well, I agree with what your stand. I am 100% right there. I think that's what Nita was saying also. We don't want to say don't come and don't worship, but at the same time, put them in a position to teach. That's an endorsement of what's going on. And yeah, that's right. And I don't believe that's right. Yes, sir. You going to disagree with your wife? Surely not. Well, that passage is Matthew 18. If your brother sins, it's not just a disagreement. It's not just you have a falling out with someone. If your brother sins against you, go show him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you've gained your brother. If he hears you not, take with you one or two witnesses. That is witnesses to the initial infraction. Not someone saying, not saying, I have something against Dan, and I'm going to talk to, and I'm going to ask Dan and Jim to go, rather David and Jim to go with me to hear what I have to say to Dan. That's not it. It's like, I want you to listen to what I have to say. Take with you one or two witnesses, people who witnessed the initial infraction. And if he hears them, you've gained your brother. If he hears them not, then he says, let them be unto thee as the publican and sinner. That is, that you're not fellowshipping that individual. That's right. And here's a good thought about it, and that is, how many times must you go? Well, we're not told. We're just told, go to by yourself, take with you witnesses, and then if he doesn't hear the witnesses. So that's about someone sins against you, and I would think it would have to be the underscoring fact here is it's a sin against you, and it is something that people have witnessed that have occurred. That's my understanding of that. Now, that's my thought on that text. So anybody has another idea on that? David? No, I would not say that. No, that's, in my view, that would not be a Matthew 18 scenario, even though the general thought about going and talking covers that. So here's maybe an illustration that might be more like what Lisa was talking about. So in the late 1980s, there was a woman in Collinsville, Oklahoma, named Marion Gwynn. Do you remember the Marion Gwynn story? Marion Gwynn was a member of the church in Collinsville, Oklahoma, and she was a single woman, but they discovered, and they were helping her. They would continue to give her monies, and they did the foods on Saturdays, and they take her the meals and all that kind of thing. But they discovered that she was living with a man. So they went to her, and they said, you need to get out of the situation. We'll help you, and we'll help you live alone, but you need to not live with a man that you're not married to. So they went to her a number of times, but she did not ever respond positively. So finally, they stood up and they withdrew fellowship from her, following Matthew 18. Mary and Gwen is living with the man with withdraw fellowship, and the withdrawing fellowship is simply we recognize as a congregation that she's not living faithfully, and we'd like to withdraw fellowship. And we want you to recognize that to be the case. Announced it publicly. They made her name public. Well, when that happened, then she went to lawyers, and the lawyers, of course, got involved, and they talked about how, okay, they embarrassed her publicly, and so it went in national news. She went on the Phil Donahue show, talked about how terrible the Church of Christ was, withdrawing fellowship. And so they asked someone from the Church of Christ, who's a good friend of mine, he's passed away now, a great preacher of the gospel named Garland Elkins, to appear on the program with her, on the panel. So when they came out there, now Garland Elkins told me this, a number of us were standing there, and he says, here's what happened when I went to the show. I went to the show, and before I came out, before any of us came out, the producer, who was a black woman, came out there, and she railed against the churches of Christ and horrific, how terrible they treated her, and how they put a scarlet letter on her and blah, blah, and went through and got the crowd all worked up, angry. He says, when I came out, it was like a red flag in front of a bull. And so when Phil Donahue started the conversation, he started talking about it, and everybody was in the audience saying, I can't believe that any church, blah, blah, blah. And so he'd run to someone else, and they would just holler in the microphone. And Mary and Gwen was sitting up there, just it's so sad looking. She had a lawyer there. Finally, someone was a member of the church in the audience, and Phil went to him and said, you know, we have a representative of the Church of Christ, and he's on stage, and you haven't even talked to him yet. You haven't even introduced him yet. And that was true. Phil Donahue says, well, I'm sorry, I should. And now he goes and introduces Garland Elkins. And Brother Elkins went through the passages we've just talked about that Dan brought up, you know, go show him his fault, that kind of thing, in 2 Thessalonians 3, and admonish them as a brother. But it does become a ticklish issue on withdrawing fellowship, naming them publicly like that. So it's kind of challenging, because that's what happens. We're in a lawfare society, so that's what happens. Yeah, oh yeah. So he got a lot of money. So all of that, I don't know how we got off on withdrawing fellowship indifferent, but I thought, let's see, withdrawing fellowship. But that's right, indifferent. Yeah, that's where we are. But the point is, there are a lot of challenges that we're going to face, and indifference is one of them. And people withdrawing fellowship, and people who are living in sin, those are challenges that we're going to face as we knock on doors. Anything else to mention regarding that before we move on to the next? My well-planned thought was, okay, Sue, withdrawing fellowship, is that right? Yeah. Can you remember who it was? Well, we don't need to talk about it, I guess. We don't want to violate. we don't want to violate the Mary and Gwen rule. But you know, so anyway, churches are pretty hesitant to even enact church discipline today. Not because of that incident, but because I think churches really ignore 1 Corinthians 5 a lot. That's my view. Yes, sir, Dan. That's correct. That's how I see it. So I've knocked on doors, and you have too, and people that are living together. But if I want to study the Bible, I want to study the Bible. That's going to come up eventually. Obviously, it's going to come up before we go to the waters of baptism. We're going to talk about that. But I am certainly not going to say, when I first walk in, hey, this has got to change before I open the Bible with any of you. I'm just not going to do that. And I think that we need to get them on safe ground, and as we come to the point where they can be on safe ground, then we'll work on that. But and I don't want any surprises. I don't want to baptize them and say, hey, by the way, now you're living with her, you're living with him. By the way, you got to get out now. I don't want that to be a surprise. So it's kind of a touchy issue, and that's a frequent occurrence nowadays, isn't it? A lot of people. I mean, you see it everywhere, and that's just our culture, sadly. But so that's how I handle some of those. Not that I've always been successful. Sometimes I've offended when I don't mean to offend. But I think I try to do as gingerly as I can as I get into the study with it and try to open the Bible, and then that will come up, I think. That's my thought on it. Yes, ma'am. You can do that. I just ask if they're interested in studying the Bible, we'd like to study with you. If you care to study the Bible and see what God has to say on, I'm open to come in here and we'll just have a Bible study and we'll talk about it. And I talk about the plan of salvation. And when I talk about repentance, then I'll talk about getting out of sin. And if that's part of the sin, I'm going to talk about that. But I do. If that approach is not wrong, yeah, I would not say. I'm not saying anything's right or wrong on these approaches. I'm just, well, no, you don't want to, but sometimes people, yeah, sometimes people do get frustrated or angry. That's right. Okay, let's look at the non-resident church member for a moment, number 7, before we ran out of time here. Non-resident church member, what do I mean by that? So I mean, okay, so let's take Lisa, for example. Here's if someone, she came, you mind me using you for an example? Someone who moves into the area from a member of the Lord's church, moves into the area, and so you might knock on the door, or you might visit with them at work, or visit with them somewhere, and they say, well, yes, I'm a member of the Church of Christ, but my membership is in Colorado. Well, okay, so how do we handle that? How do we handle, okay, now she didn't do that. First thing she did, she sought out the church here where she wanted to be. And that's good. That's right. Amen. That's right. But some people say, okay, I'm a member of the Church of Christ, but I'm coming down to Iowa Park, and then you're visiting with them, and I'm a member of the church. I just moved, or I've been here for 6 months from Colorado. Well, they haven't looked for a church home at all. So how do we handle that? That is, and I'm glad you mentioned that, the military, because that's where it happens so frequently. There are a lot of military people coming in, maybe staying for 1 year or 6 months for some short tour of study, training, whatever it may be, individuals. So let's look at an illustration in the New Testament, and this is Acts chapter 9. And there should be an outreach for those individuals, as Dan mentioned. This is Paul. So Paul, remember, was converted when he was in the city of Damascus. He was baptized into Christ, convicted on the Damascus road that Jesus was alive. So finally, after all of this, we're told that beginning in verse 23, when many days were fulfilled, the Jews took counsel together to kill him, but the plot became known to Saul. And they watched the gates day and night also that they might kill him. But the disciples took him by night, led him down through the wall, lowering him in a basket. Now apparently there was a lot of time that passed from that last line until the next one here. When he was come to Jerusalem, what was the first thing he wanted to do? He wanted to be numbered with the disciples. Here the text says, assayed, which means he wanted to join the disciples, not join the church, but he wanted to be part of the assembly of Christian people there in Jerusalem. That was the first thing that he did. He sought out the church. And that's what we need to be about, people who are Christians. So when people are a Christian, let's go back to Dan's illustration, in the military, and they're here for a short period of time, or maybe a 9-month stint, and they don't seek out the congregation. A lot of times we have a misunderstanding about the church. There's universal church, but there's also the local congregation, and that's the one with which we work and can only work in a local congregational setting. That's the one that Paul wanted to be a part of. And so the first thing he did was seek out to be a part of the church. Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, yeah. It's always good, even when you're traveling like that, or if you're traveling just through, or if you're there for a period, to as this text says, say to join to the disciples. That is, try to be a part of the church that is there. That's what the example is in the New Testament. Yes, sir. I would say my personal reaction is, I think that's good as far as it goes. That is, to be hooked into spiritual teaching, but there is a element of fellowship, participation with the local church that we need. Yep. So, all right, anything else to mention? All right, thank you for your participation in class. I hope that it was edifying and we're thoughtful about it. Thank you for helping me out with it.